All right, hello everybody from me. I'm Matthias. Just introducing the next speakers for the next session. Yeah, we're very happy to have so many great speakers already and also for the next session. The next session will be real-world applications and technologies in neuroscience. And our first speaker will be Justin Baker from McLean Institute for Technology, McLean Hospital, Harvard Medical School. So yeah, if everybody can slowly find their seats, and then I think we can directly start.
All right. Well, thank you, Matthias, and thanks for the organizers for inviting me today. So I'm Justin Baker. I'm a psychiatrist at McLean Hospital, which is just a few miles west of here. And I'd like to talk to you today about how we're trying to bring data science into register with lived experience for patients, particularly with mental health issues. Number of lab members I want to acknowledge, as well as my disclosures, a couple of whom are here today. So how do we assess that someone might be experiencing a mental health condition? The way that we've traditionally tried to think about this is in a case control kind of model where people have a condition or they're a so-called control or healthy person, and that we might be able to put them onto some kind of behavioral or biological state space to determine who has or who doesn't have the condition. But of course, in reality, this is much more complicated. There are many different kinds of caseness. We've already today heard about several of these in mental health. But also we have this issue that many of the conditions we're trying to capture are continua from health into disease. And on top of that, we have individuals who may be experiencing multiple conditions within themselves. So how do we capture this in a way that really is face valid? And so the way that we've thought about this is, I think, especially with some of the earlier talks we've heard about control systems theory, is to really think about latent construct models. So models where we're using sensory information to inform on a latent construct through some kind of intelligent feature extraction. And we've already, again, heard today about how the brain does this in the case of like locomotion and other things, and that it has to identify latent states, latent information, but then it uses movements to generate feedback or new information about that to iterate and gradually learn about the world. The way we think about this is that the clinicians are also using closed-loop control systems type approaches to understand about their patients. They're taking information from the sensory systems, trying to match it with the training that they've had, and then ultimately be able to map that onto latent constructs such as mental state or diagnosis. And then by using interventions, whether it's speaking or nonverbal interventions, we can generate feedback from our patients. And then what I'd like to talk about today is how we're using actual sensors and different kinds of systems on patients who are moving about their lives and to try to understand something about those individuals' latent state spaces as well. And so there's many types of data. We've already heard today about several of these, whether it's raw data from surveys, or all the way on the right side, data from EHRs or MRI scanners, et cetera. But there's also many different types of inputs that we can now capture from patients, whether it's videos, microphones, wearables, et cetera. But again, taking just those raw signals aren't going to be able to map directly into latent spaces, so we have to use intelligent feature extraction, which we can do in a number of ways. But ultimately, we really want to be able to map all of these raw data into the state spaces that we care most about as clinicians. And then just to zoom out from that, we really see this as dovetailing with everything on the bottom part of this graph, which is once we have that kind of computational phenotype, we can then use that to synthesize and to detect changes over time, and then to develop software that integrates those insights with sort of design principles that patients can then use, or providers or other people. And then we can also then build tools for research support, clinician support, biobanking, et cetera. And so the study that I'd like to focus on today, we sometimes call it a year in the life study, because the idea here was to go beyond the kind of caricature view of what a condition like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or depression might actually be, and really to try to map this onto what the lived experience of someone with these conditions might have. So These conditions are often presenting in early adulthood where this is not the only thing going on in this person's life. They're also trying to get back into relationships, get back to school, get back to work, and so on. And so we really wanted to capture change both in symptoms but also in objective measures as people were navigating their real lives while also navigating a condition such as these mental health conditions. And so we also sometimes call this the 100-person study because the idea was to get 100-person years of dense, intensive longitudinal phenotyping from individuals who had a range of psychiatric conditions, depression, bipolar disorder, psychosis, and to follow them over a period of time that they would be likely to experience an episode, some kind of significant worsening in their condition. And then to be able to integrate self-report data, so how are they feeling personally, clinician evaluations, how does a third party or this clinician evaluate how they're doing, as well as objective measures of sleep, activity, and then things like processing speed and cognitive control, things that you've also heard a little bit about today. And then to link changes, when these people experience episodes, be able to link changes in those reported and objective outcomes together. We had a very broad eligibility criteria for this project, so really any adult who owned a smartphone was eligible if they had had a recent history of fluctuating mood or cognition. That probably applies to many of us in the audience. The individual patient participant timeline was as shown here, so patients wore a wearable device. In this case, we used something called the Gene Active Watch, which had a very long battery life, about 1 month of continuous accelerometry. They also had an app running on their phone. I think BWE is one of the sponsors of this conference. That was the app that was running on their phone. And then every month or so, they would come in for a study visit with a human. Initially, this was pre-COVID, so they would come in person to the hospital. And then they would also perform these cognitive games on a platform called Test My Brain, which collaborator Laura Germain's developed to be able to get web-based neuropsychological testing. So the idea here, again, was to collect pseudo-continuous data from the wearable and the phone sensors, and then integrate that with daily assessments from a smartphone-based survey, as well as more open-ended responses from a daily diary, and then to be able to pull that in with clinical assessments that would be conducted both in person and then over video conference. And the goal here was to pull out a number of both passive and active sensors and behaviors, so things we could collect without the patient having to do anything, as well as places where they would have to respond. And then finally, to map that into a latent construct space where we could then map into things such as energy levels, perceived energy, actual amount of energy, as well as sleep, both perceived and measured, things that we would expect to be significantly changing as a function of when someone's experiencing conditions like depression, mania, and psychosis. So here's the participant table on the left. So again, we were not concerned particularly with diagnoses here, but we did want to show changes in depression scores. The MADRS is a depression rating scale, or mania, or these positive and negative symptoms, which are significant symptoms of psychotic conditions. And again, the idea here was to really take an N of 1 approach, recognizing that even across 100 people, we were unsure whether we were going to see 100 completely different phenotypes or whether we would really see clear clusters of phenotypes into these more classic syndromes. And so I'm going to take you through just 3 or 4 case examples to give you a flavor for the kinds of data we've collected. And I'll mention at the outset here that we've collected this data set not to zero in on any one hypothesis, but really to create and curate a data set that will be available to the research community. So as you're looking through this data, if there are certain questions that you would have as a researcher in this area, please be in contact with me and we might be able to provide you with that data. So 4G is a 25-year-old male with a schizoaffective bipolar type condition. He struggles with focus and organization. He lives in a group home and has very little contact with other people aside from playing poker with his friends. And here we're showing a multimodal representation of both the periodic assessments right at the top. I don't know if this pointer will work or not, but I'll just point with my hand. So the very top shows when he comes in for scans and when he comes in for clinical visits. And then below that, you can see how often he performs surveys. Each column of this representation is a day of the study. And then below that, you can see his voice diaries. And then you can see representations of where he was going, his location relative to his home location, and then how his wrist was moving as well as how his phone was moving to give an indication of sleep and activity. And then finally, at the bottom, you see representations of light and then calls and text. So you can see he didn't make many phone calls, but he's texting quite a bit over the course of the day. Well, so what was interesting about this patient is when he first came into the hospital for the study, this is his baseline MRI, his structural MRI scan. He showed a number of structural abnormalities based on his free surface. So he showed a lot of volume shrinkage in places like hippocampus, amygdala. On the right is all of the cortical thickness measurements. So he showed a number of areas that were thin compared to others of his age range. And so that was his baseline structural scan. Consistent with what we know about schizophrenia is that people often will have volume or ventricular enlargement and some thinning in cortex. But what we saw is that functionally, he actually showed a fairly normative pattern. So I'm not going to go through this representation in detail, but just suffice to say, any of the red colors are areas where there's a value that's lower than expected. Blue colors are higher than expected. So here on the right side, we're looking at his functional connectome. So you were hearing earlier about resting state functional connectivity. That's what was measured on the right. So we can see that, if anything, he has very normative functional connectivity with even a little bit higher levels of connectivity in the default mode and the salience network and the somatomotor network. We also saw that he performed relatively normally on some behavioral tasks that we did while he was in the scanner. But what was interesting is then when he came in a few weeks later, here I'm showing in register with the scan information on the top plot, the heat map below it is his sleep-wake pattern. And I haven't shown you a lot of normal versions of these, but you may be able to appreciate that there's not a nice blue band there between midnight and let's say 9 a.m. What you see is there's a lot of activity, higher levels of movement during the night for this individual. And so he came in for that third visit, and interestingly, when I asked him how he was doing, he said, everything's going great, everything's fine. And then I said, well, there must be something wrong with your watch then, because it looks like you've been sleeping during the day and really up in the middle of the night. And he said, yeah, doc, now that you mention it, my sleep has been awful. They changed my medications. I haven't really been doing very well. So what did he show on his brain scan? Oh, well, this is just showing that he was, in fact, sleeping mostly during the day during that period. So what was interesting then, and this is N of 1, I'm just showing it for a proof of concept, is that over the 4 scans that he had during this period, his structural scan didn't change, not surprisingly. He continued to show that volume changes for all 4 of those scans. What was interesting is when we then looked at his functional scans, the first 2 scans showed a normative pattern, but when he came in for that 3rd scan, when he had been sort of sleep deprived, what we start to see is changes happening in his functional networks. So part of the frontal parietal control network that you heard about earlier, as well as the dorsal attention network, we're starting to show reductions in their connectivity. And I didn't have time today to go into this, but this was consistent with some of the work we had seen in a group study where we compared 100 patients with schizophrenia with 100 patients or 100 healthy controls. These were the networks that were abnormal at that group level. But here what we're seeing is that there's an indication that this might have been more of a state effect, that as this patient was getting more ill, having some more symptoms, that's when we start to see the abnormalities. And sure enough, when he came back in a few weeks later for that 4th scan, his functional connectivity was back into that normative range again, consistent, well, at least parsimonious with him also having normative sleep at that point. So this is, again, you've heard already about some of these networks in the earlier presentations, but this was consistent with this idea that in patients who have a psychotic condition, there seems to be changes that are occurring within these higher order association systems. And this patient at least gave us this idea that perhaps this was occurring in a way that was more state dependent and might even resolve with successful treatment. So I want to show you now a different example of a separate patient from this study. So this is a patient who, unlike the first example, was really not struggling with psychosis as much as just depression. So at the very beginning of the study, and here I'm showing you 700 days of time over which we followed this individual, and I'll just make a couple of points here. First is that we can see in her self-report, that heat map, she was actually very consistently able to respond to these 30-question surveys every single day. I think like some of the early presentations, when we started the study, we weren't getting NIH funding because people said, like, no one will ever do this, especially not patients who have a condition. And what we found is, like, not everyone does it, but there are patients like this who both have a condition and are willing to perform these kind of measures consistently. So what you can see here is that she was doing quite well for the first 100 days or so of the study. But then around day 100, she starts feeling very depressed in a really dense way. She starts endorsing feeling hostile, irritable. You probably can't read those words on the left there, but really consistently showing that she was not doing well. And then you can see that normalized around day 200, and she started feeling really good again. And then again, around another 100 days later, she starts feeling really poorly. And then you can see the episodes, as she goes further into the study, become briefer, but in some ways just as dense. So not surprisingly, the conventional ratings, that MADRS score, did mostly correlate with how she was feeling on a day-to-day basis. But as you can appreciate, towards the end of the study, she wasn't able to, we lose that granularity where she's going through more brief episodes, but according to the MADRS, it just looks like she's staying at kind of a higher level of depression that whole time. So here, one other anecdote is that she was only coming into those visits when she was feeling better. So towards the end of the study, you'll notice that those dots are only occurring during periods of, the dots in the MADRS are only occurring during periods of time when she's actually in her positive mood state. And yet the way that the MADRS scores, you're asked to recollect the past 2 to 4 weeks of how you've been feeling. So even though she was feeling well when she came in, the research assistant appropriately scored her as having a very high MADRS score. So again, this just highlights how doing studies in a more lab-based or clinical environment can really miss a lot of the key details. If, let's say, you're trying to link that MADRS score with a brain change, you're going to completely miss the fact that she's doing well. And then finally, I want to really link this, in this case, to her objective data. So here, again, the first point is just that she was willing to wear this wearable device throughout the 700-day period really quite consistently. So on the very top plot, what you're seeing is a heat map of her activity levels, white being where she took the watch off or where we didn't have the data. And so you can see that, especially in the first half of that first year of the study, she really kept the watch on very consistently throughout that period of time. The next point is just how her sleep and activity changed when she got depressed. So again, I don't have the pointer, but what you can sort of appreciate is that right around that day 100 mark, there's a significant change in her sleep pattern. She starts sleeping later in the morning, so getting up quite a bit later in her sleep offset time or wake time. But then also you might notice that the color while she's awake, so that red color that you see when she's active during the day becomes more orange while she's depressed. So this is consistent with not only is she sleeping longer, but she's much less active while she's awake. And again, that's consistent with what we would clinically see as like a psychomotor slowing when people get profoundly depressed. And you can see that pattern continues through some of the other episodes, some to a greater extent than others. So you see the sleep duration gets longer in most of the episodes, and then that low activity is present in many of the episodes as well. And what this allows us to do is begin to model what may be going on under the hood, so to speak, in terms of a latent state that her brain or her body is experiencing. And so that's where we can take a day-to-day deficit, if you will, from if you move a lot and you don't sleep very much, then you might be in a little bit of energy deficit the next day, right? And so what we did here was simply take that kind of logic through the entire 700 days to see that over that first period of time, even though she was feeling well, we hypothesized that perhaps there was a latent energy deficit that was accumulating, such that when she hit some threshold, that kicked her system into a more conservative energy state, which allowed her to recover her energy, but as a result, or perhaps as part of that syndrome, she felt really bad. And so this is some of the evidence that we take to suggest that perhaps depression and mania are not simply subjective states that are about psychology, but are actually energy conservation strategies that the body goes into to preserve some kind of homeostasis, and that some of the subjective experiences that people have may even be secondary to some of the core energy requirements that are occurring. Purely a theory, but again, just something that we can try to take from this more in-the-world-based assessments. And again, I'm not going to, for interest of time, go into the theory behind this, but we've developed a theory based on energy balance, both at the local or day-to-day basis, and then extending that to a sort of more global energy balance in terms of how we can maybe conserve energy over longer periods of time when needed by survival. And then to bring this into a more normative framework, we also then looked at this data from the UK Biobank, where we have a week's worth of actigraphy data from over 100,000 individuals. And so what we were able to show is if on the right here, what you can see is the average week of a human activity. So you can see the periods when people are sleeping, when they're awake. But then what gets interesting is to see how this changes over the lifespan. So on the left side here, I'm showing you heat maps for females, for males and females. And what you can appreciate is that as you get older, that activity that's during the day goes from a red color to a more green color, consistent with the fact that as we get older, our waking activity goes down pretty significantly. And so what we looked at then was how this changes a function of whether people had recent depression or not. And so there's a lot going on in this plot, but I'll just focus on the bottom right here, which is you can see that as waking activity decreases as you age, it also decreased in a somewhat linear way based on whether or not you had depression. So individuals who were experiencing depression moved as if they were about 5 years older than their current age. So with that, you can kind of where we went was to think about, well, maybe we could use this to even have growth curves for something like waking activity, the same way when you take your child to a pediatrician, you would have growth curves for height, weight, and head circumference. And so we can begin to take all the individuals from the UK Biobank data set, which are shown in blue here, and begin to have a curve for what is normative, right? And you can have the percentiles there. And then what you can see is that these red dots at the bottom, those are our participants from the Year in the Life study. And so this participant that I showed you a moment ago is represented here. She started the study when she was about 62. And then you can see that, or I can tell you that basically when she was doing well, her daily activity was right near that median for her age range. But when she was doing poorly, those values drop into the 20th, 30th percentiles. So you can imagine that something like this might eventually serve as like a vital sign for mental health. And obviously here what was really critical was that we didn't just have this data for the participants in our study, but we have similar comparable data from a much larger population level data set. Another really critical type of data that we can pull from individuals' phones is location. We've already heard about how context-dependent behavior is. That's why we're all here. I think we recognize the importance of being able to assess behavior in many different contexts. And so location really gives you a readout into the kind of context that someone might be in any given day. And so here I'm showing you an individual who had a bipolar disorder and was followed over more than 2 years. And I'll show you just a couple of features here. One is that the gray location is their home location. That's the most common location that they spent time at. And then you can see that while they were at their home location at night most of the time, a few weeks into the study, they go to this blue location for about 10 days. Any guesses what that blue location might be? They go there for 10 days or so twice during the first part of the study. And then if you're looking closely, you can see that they also go to that location during the week. So during like normal business hours, you see it, and then also in some evenings. So any guesses? Anyone want to hazard a guess what that location might represent? Yeah, just shout it out. Sorry? Yeah, so it turns out to be the hospital. So when they go to that location during the day, they're going to see their therapist. When they go in the evening, that's their AA meeting. So it's a place where there's multiple functions going on. But when they go there for 10 days, that's when they get hospitalized. And so they also have a part-time job. You can see that in terms of the teal location here at the beginning. And then you can see towards the end of this, or the second half or so, they go to a different part-time job location in the black location. And you can maybe be able to appreciate that in the middle there's a period of time after the second hospitalization when they're really only going back and forth between the home location and that blue location, the hospital location. And then finally, the orange location you can appreciate, that's actually a significant other location, a place that they would go as they're developing a relationship. And so the point here is that we can use location to actually collect a minimally burdensome continuous assessment of community and social functioning, which, here are 7 examples of individuals with different kinds of daily lives. And we can really begin to, in a privacy-preserving way, capture what's going on with this person from a social community function standpoint. So I'm just going to end here in a moment, but again, I want to emphasize that these data are available if you're interested in working with these kinds of intensive longitudinal data. The key here is not just any one data type, but really those conjunctions of data types where you have not just a clinical evaluation, but an audio diary, or not just location, but also location plus a cognitive game and so on. So we have quite a number of person years worth of these kinds of data that are available for analysis. We might get into it in the question and answer period, but this kind of work also raises a number of ethical, legal, and social implications as we have real-time access to people's behavior and locations. We've written about this if you want to check that out. We've also developed an ethics checklist for people doing this kind of intensive longitudinal assessment work. So how do you think about informed consent in a case where you're following people for years and they might have forgotten what they were onboarded with? How do you think about returning their own individualized research results? Would some of these plots be useful for the patient, or do you have to mediate that through a clinician or so on? And I won't go into it here, but we have written about that latter point with a number of ethicists and legal experts to really navigate how to begin returning results, not just because it's good to do, but also it helps us scale this work. Paying people for this much data through monetary reasons can get challenging to scale it. But if we could provide people intrinsic motivation by getting to see their own data, interact with it, we think that would also allow us to collect larger data sets. We're also part of a number of other projects where we're taking these tools beyond that, on the order of 100 people, but really now moving it into the order of thousands of individuals who we can follow over longer periods of time. Such as the Accelerated Medicine Partnership, which is a global study of kids with prodromal schizophrenia, and that's still ongoing. But those data, as well as the ones I mentioned, are being released to the public for anyone who wants to analyze these kinds of work. And so again, just to wrap up, the idea here is to really use behavioral variation to understand brain and disease. We started off being very focused on the neuroscience. As we got more into this, realizing that our ability to capture behavior at both a very fine time scale in terms of seconds of data, but as well as being able to zoom out and look at data over years, we think really gives us different kinds of channels to think about how the brain can go awry. And again, the goal here is to be able to move past a more caricature view of cases and controls to something which is much more computationally defined, and that would also help us guide with treatment planning and understanding the brain. So with that, I will just wrap up and happy to take any questions. Any questions?
Seems to be working. Thank you for a fascinating talk. Really important work trying to predict when mental health stuff is coming on, and great data mining. Did you look at heart rate variability measures? Did your smartwatches collect that? The overnight heart rate variability is a pretty good indicator of stress levels, autonomic nervous system stress, and a number of smartwatches are giving athletes and other people that sort of information.
No, it's a great question. I think this comes back to we didn't collect that, and the reason was, in this particular study, we just decided that based on the patients we were seeing, we wanted to find a watch. We ultimately ended up focusing on battery life as the main feature of the watch. We let them use their own phones because they were going to charge their own phones, but for the watch, we were going to give them a device. We initially went through like the Empatica device and other things like that. Because you have to charge them every day and these patients have these kinds of conditions, we were just not as confident that they would do it. That said, some of the other work we're doing, like in a hospitalized setting, we are starting to use more watches like the more recent Embrace Plus and things like that for heart rate variability. So great question.
Batteries are getting a lot better too.
That's absolutely true. So it's more feasible, yep.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. That's a fantastic data set. I was wondering in the longitudinal aspect with especially these kind of older adults, if you're able to see kind of directionality, especially as mobility can start to be an issue for just getting around and kind of who's leading who, whether maybe mobility is affecting their ability to get around and that's kind of causing the depression, or if in that population, if it's the depression kind of causing the lack of, or maybe not causing, but directing the mobility changes.
That's a great question. So she was one of our older participants, I will say. So most of the folks were on the younger side. Also, I guess we really, for this project, was strictly observational. We weren't treating them, so we didn't even know we knew which drugs they were getting, but we weren't paying, close attention in terms of like when they took it and when they did it. So on an individual case basis, we would really try to understand the causality for each person to see when they were doing better, what did they think was making the difference. And so, there are certainly people who we could start to figure that out, or at least have a theory. And then we would, as we followed them for longer, see whether a theory we had early on played itself out in future episodes. So I would have to say, in this woman's case, we'd have to go back and look at that. I know she had some movement abnormalities that we noted as she was moving along, but we didn't specifically have. She didn't comment on mobility issues, but it's a great point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, Justin. Really beautiful talk. I was really intrigued by the idea when you mentioned that there could be like an activity percentile, like there are for height and weight. And I was curious, like, what do you think it would take to get there? Like, how much data? And do you think that in the clinic, clinicians would be like amenable to this idea? Like, what do you see as like the future for that sort of digital phenotyping, like entering the clinic?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I think, when we started this, well, I guess if you have no data, you can at least look at somebody relative to themselves. And I think that's what all clinicians do when they never met somebody before. But for a lot of these kinds of data, whether it's speaking rate or activity, there are real numbers associated with it. And so when we started to ask clinicians about what would make this useful, what would it take to get you to actually use this in your practice, they want to know normative ranges. And so they know that 5 hours may be too short and 10 may be too long, but they couldn't tell you what's normative. And certainly for like waking activity, like we all have a sense of like, okay, well, certain thousands of steps is normal, but how does that change with age? How does it change with conditions? So I think my sense is to really get these things to reach clinical utility, we're going to have ways of collecting normative samples, different genders, different cultural backgrounds. I think in the meantime, my hope is that we don't have to wait for that. We should start collecting it and try to instrument looking at that individual relative to themselves, so that at least that part can be useful to the clinician. But I guess I see in the longer term, over the next years, similar with the brain data I was showing, a radiologist would never have picked out that person's brain was shrunk relative to a healthy 25-year-old, but we could easily see that that's the case from the free surfer data because we have normative samples of brain data. So I think the more I work with this kind of data, it's clear that once you have the normative ranges, it really takes it up a level in terms of utility.
Thanks.
Thank you for an intriguing talk, and I think that my question was partially just answered by your comment now, but originally my question was going to be how far you think this type of data and this approach can turn into a closed loop type of system, both from the clinician and into a tool that the clinician can use, or a tool that the patient can use, sort of like a red flag. My phone gives me a notification that you're going into a pattern that looks like one of the recurring depression cycles that you tend to do. Thank you.
No, I think that's exactly where we sort of see it. Initially when we were doing this work, we were thinking of it as a way to get a better capture of what the brain was doing, if we could at least measure that. But the more we've been doing this work, it's clear that there is this potential for more of a closed loop, or at least a loop. Let's just say, where similar to the anecdote I gave where initially the patient said he was doing great, and then when I showed him the data, he changed his answer a bit, and it created more of a conversation. So I think, especially given working with these kind of patients, people don't always know how they're doing, or they don't remember something that happened, or they're sometimes unwilling to share something. But if you have an objective data source, then it allows you to just kind of continue hypothesis testing and talk to that. And then to the other piece of it, I think having like just-in-time adaptive interventions where, based on a pattern of data, let's say the person isn't leaving their house for a while, you could deliver interventions directly to them. You could have somebody call them or go to their home, or things like that. I think we'll definitely start to see. We're already starting to see more examples of that. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
It's a great talk. Thank you. I think you just partially answered my question. I was thinking, like, when you mentioned about like asking the patient to interact with the data, and you are trying to make them intrinsically motivated to continue this study. I'm thinking, like, by doing this, will you be able, like, will the patient's condition improve by knowing how they are doing, or is it more on the therapeutic side? It would be like better for physicians to administer like new like therapies in the future.
I think it's all of the above, right? I think we see so many different kinds of patients who have different motivations depending on, sometimes we'll have patients, we have started returning like sleep reports to patients on to the clinicians on the inpatient units. And those clinicians often like to share with the patients. And the patients say, like, now that I know what normal sleep looks like, I want to know how my sleep is doing because I didn't know it was abnormal before I got here, but now it's clear what I'm trying to get at. So similar to, like, if you have a weight loss goal or whatever, like, if you actually know for you what's red flag level of sleep or activity, you can then begin to kind of titrate it. But I think other patients won't want to look at it themselves. They'll want someone else to manage it for them, just like the blood pressure or any other number that you might have. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for this talk. I thought the energy restoration theory was quite interesting, underlying the different symptoms. And I was wondering, in that framework of the energy restoration, how do you explain the threshold shift? For example, for this one participant or for this one subject that you showed, there were like periods of long periods of positive symptoms and long periods of negative symptoms. And then, I mean, you could see this in the energy curve. However, towards the end of the monitoring, there were many rapid changes. How would that fit in that theory?
Yeah, great question. I mean, obviously, it's still a theory, and so a lot of parameters that are open parameters at this point. So, like, for instance, we made a homeostatic assumption there, which is that at the very beginning and the very end of the curve had to be the same point, and so that's probably a wrong assumption, right? So there's how we think about the thresholds changing. Whether it's that the drift rate is changing or whether the thresholds somehow change with treatment. It may be that some medications function by changing the thresholds or other things like that. So I think it's a great observation. We think this kind of framework, to really test it mechanistically, we'll have to be able to follow people and get maybe other ways of tracking actual energy through metabolic measurements and things like that. But yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Let's thank our speaker again.